Wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show, and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I've got with me today Micah Rowland. He is the Chief Operating Officer over at Fountain. Micah, how's it going today?
Going great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Micah, we're going to be talking about maybe a somewhat controversial topic. I've heard this advice over and over again throughout my career, and that's that you should hire slow and fire fast. And you're going to be dispelling that a little bit, especially for startups, and talking about why that might actually be horrible advice to follow. But before we get into that, let's provide listeners with a little bit of background, who you are, what you and the team at Fountain have been up to these days, and why you're so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Logan. So I have been at Fountain for about 15 months. And in the context of our company, I lead customer success, finance, HR and recruiting, business operations. And then we have some relationships with legal and security consultants around various compliance issues as well. Prior to Fountain, I've been in a variety of roles in the SaaS world over the last roughly 8 years. And before that, I had a couple of different iterations in my career, starting with time as a software engineer after college, which is basically what I studied in college, and then time as a management consultant and a brand manager in the packaged goods / retail industry. So I've done a number of different things until the beginning of 2012 when I settled into my current groove in the software world.
I love it. So, Micah, tell me a little bit about why you're so passionate about this topic of dispelling this common advice. And then we're going to be speaking to both sides of it, right? What are some of the problems with trying to hire slow, and what are some of the problems with firing fast? But I would love to hear a little bit on, why this topic is so important to you.
I think it's a couple of reasons. There are a couple of reasons why this is important to me. One is because I see many companies in the world of venture-backed startups and Silicon Valley being told that there are certain playbooks or heuristics they can use to dramatically improve their company's performance. And I think a lot of those are either flat out wrong or derived from a limited subset of experiences that are not going to apply everywhere. And in some cases, those things that founders are told are not particularly damaging if you go along with them. But this is one that can be quite damaging. And so I think that it's more important to be constantly problem solving to figure out what works for your company and how your company's situation may be different than the person that you heard speak at an incubator or at a conference who told about their version of their story and their company. And by the way, the version they told probably did not include all of the relevant facts, some of which might cause you to question some of the conclusions they came to. So that's one reason. The second reason is probably a little bit more personal, which is that as many people in Silicon Valley can probably attest to, I myself have been in a situation of having been let go, and in a situation where I was let go on the basis of what I would argue was a too quick decision. And as I've reflected upon that decision over the years in my career that have elapsed since that time, my primary thought was that that particular person who made the decision was acting on a faulty diagnosis of what was going on. And it turned out fine for me in the long run, but certainly in the short run, it was jarring. It made it difficult for me to move on to the next role in my career. And I've had a lot of people go through similar experiences. And many times what is the root cause of that experience is a philosophy of hiring that follows this very common saying. And I think it's because a lot of the startups out there, they want people to take ownership. They want to really make sure that they're hiring top talent. And a way to be really going after the top talent in a way that sounds aggressive and cool and exciting is to say this: hire slow, fire fast. And I just think that it, as I said before, it can be really damaging to the company and to the people involved.
Yeah. And as you shared from your personal experience, that it has repercussions. And so we need to think long and hard about something that we hold near and dear and is so important in driving the way that we make decisions, especially that impact hiring, people's lives, the culture of the company that we are trying to build. So let's specifically talk about, both aspects of this standard advice within the lens of startups, because I think there are some specific challenges and pitfalls to following this advice that you and I have talked about when it comes to startups. Let's take the first part of it. Let's talk about hire slow and why that can just be simply hard to do and what some of the pitfalls might be there.
Right. So I think startups, they oftentimes want to feel like they're attracting and hiring the best talent. And so this hire slow mentality conveys the notion that you've got a really high bar. You want to make sure that somebody's fit is really perfect and that you have somebody who's going to be part of a machine that's going to grow and change rapidly. Therefore, they can adjust rapidly. I think the reality, though, is that many startups do not have the process or do not have the fidelity in their hiring process to actually follow that advice, hire slow. And I'll give a couple of examples that illustrate what I mean. First is, if you have a group of candidates who are coming in to apply to your job and you spend the time that it takes to slowly evaluate all of them and then possibly think, oh, maybe this person isn't quite good enough. I think they're good enough, but there's this other person that you go weeks and months. Generally speaking, those candidates are going to go find other opportunities. They're going to think you're not interested in them. The only companies that can get away with a really long job process are the companies that have very high brand recognition and have the luxury to keep candidates waiting. For those of us in small companies, it's a fallacy to think that you can do that. And so if you allow your process to stretch on and on and on, then you're going to be losing good candidates. The second thing is, I think a lot of companies, they have this idea that they want to wait for this unicorn candidate, but in reality, those companies don't have a hiring process that is scientific enough, for lack of a better word, to ensure that the candidates that you're letting in really are as high quality as you think they are. Most companies, if you think about the way that the process works, are going to result in a candidate spending some relatively short amount of time with the company. It's probably on the order of 5 to 15 hours. 15 hours of interviews is a very robust set of interviews. But if you think about the nature and the extent of the situations that puts you in with respect to this person, to see how they're actually going to react to your questions and so forth, it's not very deep. You're going to learn a limited set of things about those folks. And most companies are not even particularly tight in terms of the consistency, the depth, and the thoroughness of the process they use. And so if you're in a company and you're thinking, I want to make sure that this person is the exact right cultural fit, that this person has the exact right skill set, and that they're flexible and adaptive enough to be in the role down the road when we're a lot larger and when we're facing different challenges, you'd better make sure you have a process that's going to give you the correct positive read on candidates, and that isn't going to have a bunch of false negatives that are caused by your own biases or something about the process that isn't going to have a false positive, again, that are caused by your own biases. And so building such a process is not easy. And I think what it means is that if you're choosing folks without that process, you have a very high chance of failure in the selection process. So later we'll come to this when we talk about the fire fast component of the advice. But it's always very important to remember you as a company selected this candidate. And if you did so in a slow way, then it may or may not mean anything about their rightness for the role or their fit for the role, but it does mean that you haven't built a process that is high fidelity yet. And that's because it's hard to do. It's very hard to do on a limited set of information about the person, especially in a setting where they're able to present and put their best foot forward. So oftentimes somebody's past experience can give you some idea of what they've accomplished, but it can be very difficult truly to evaluate someone's past experience as well. So I see a lot of companies that are looking for this unicorn. They may not actually be able to attract the unicorn because they're not very prominent. Or one of my favorite bugbears, we want to hire top talent, but we don't want to pay top compensation. There's a mismatch there. And those companies oftentimes wind up in this weird situation where you think, oh, this person, I think they could do the job, but here's this person that looks really good. I haven't spoken to them yet, but I'm gonna let the process go. And then you find out as you uncover more information, you see maybe some faults. They're not quite as good as they look before. And so you're thinking, oh, the next person in the process. You string people along, and the more you find out about someone, the more reasons there are to not like them, because you're filling in all the gaps that your mind was filling in with optimistic read earlier on. So I think that it's a real challenge for companies to hire. And the core of my advice on the hire slow front is not hire fast. It's be humble about your hiring process and be self-reflective about your hiring process and the ways that the process can fail you in yielding both false positives, that is to say, people that you hire who turn out not to be right for the role, and it's really more the fault of your process for not assessing well, and false negatives, which is, I think a lot of companies turn down a lot of people who can do the job. Most jobs out there, it's not the case that there's only one or two people in the US economy that can do that job. There are many, many people who can do that job. And if you're willing to pay well and you're willing to support people, it's not that hard to find somebody who can do the job.
Hey everybody, Logan with Sweetfish here. You probably already know that we think you should start a podcast if you haven't already. But what if you have and you're asking these kinds of questions? How much has our podcast impacted revenue this year? How's our sales team actually leveraging the podcast content? If you can't answer these questions, you're actually not alone. This is why Casted created the very first content marketing platform made specifically for B2B podcasting. Now you can more easily search and share your audio content while getting greater visibility into the impact of your podcast. The marketing teams at Drift, Terminus, and here at Sweetfish have started using Casted to get more value out of our podcasts, and you probably can too. You can check out the product in action at casted.us/growth. That's casted.us/growth. All right, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points there, Micah. I mean, one, you have to be realistic about how much time do you have, right? This may be good advice in theory, but when you look at the realities of the growth goals that you're trying to hit, especially if you're venture backed and there's, that pressure for growth there, you don't necessarily have that time. And then two, as you said, hiring slow doesn't necessarily mean that your hiring process is better. It just means it's slow. It could be a little bit better, but don't fool yourself into thinking that one just comes with the other. You make some really good points there to kind of dispel that fallacy in our minds a bit. All right, let's move on to firing fast. As you and I were talking a little bit offline, some of the key downsides to firing fast in a startup environment really have to do with the experience at the management level within your fast-growing organization, right?
Yeah, I think that it is often true in fast-growing companies, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It is often true in fast-growing companies that a significant number of the people who are managing other direct reports are doing so for the first time, or they don't have a lot of experience doing that. And again, that's often a product of the fact that the company is growing, and so you give internal people opportunities, or it's a product of the fact that cash is scarce, and so you don't have the luxury to recruit candidates who have many years of experience managing folks. And there are other dynamics that can feed into this, but the consequence of that is that many times people in managerial roles in startups are in that role for the first time or for the second time. They don't have a lot of relevant prior experience. And without that relevant prior experience, what it means is the mistakes that you make are being made in a context where it's not easy to understand that they're happening when they happen. Secondly, it's not easy to fix them. And thirdly, the consequences are going to filter out through the organization in ways that you'd really rather have your managers not be making those mistakes if you're the company. Now, that's fine. That's normal. Everybody is in a managerial role for the first time at some time in their career. My point is that in a larger company, in a company that is promoting people more slowly, you often have the luxury of doing that in more of an apprenticeship model where you can sit alongside a very experienced, capable manager who can observe what you're doing, who can train and correct and give guidance and direction. And in a startup, oftentimes you don't have that luxury, because in a startup, what happens at the highest levels of the company tends to affect the hiring all the way down. And so you're hiring people at each layer with less experience than you. And so I think that experience shows up in this debate in many ways, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I think it's impossible to overstate the degree to which that impacts the assessment and the management of talent in the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you talk about there with those managers that are newer in their managerial experience, there's two key areas that could lead to firing fast that they may not have the experience, the coaching themselves to be able to do effectively. I mean, one, we think about, diagnosing when there is failure or lack of performance, being able to tell why is that happening? There are a lot of moving parts in a fast-growing startup. And then also, to your point of lack of managerial experience, I learned early in my career as a manager that a huge part of managing is dealing with performance improvement and coaching people through that. And that is an entirely different skill set. It requires a lot of different things. I mean, it looks different from functional role, whether you're in HR or finance or sales. I mean, it's huge in sales. It seems like that can be, the vast majority of a sales leader's job. But I think those two key areas can be where this lack of experience are visible the most and can lead you down the wrong path. Would you agree, Micah?
Yeah, absolutely. On the diagnosis front, I think in many, again, venture-backed startups where a lot of what's going on is rapid growth, rapid change in the organization, rapid evolution in the way that people are doing their jobs, invention of the way that people need to do their jobs. These are difficult things. And in many cases, you have companies that are in a place where they haven't yet figured out all the problems. And so if you have somebody in a role and that person is not succeeding at the measures or at the standards that you set for them, there are so many possible reasons why. And some of them do have to do with performance. But I think it is incumbent upon managers in companies like this to be honest and open-minded about the other reasons, because there are environmental issues, there are work process and business process issues, there are resourcing issues. And in many cases, the company is in a place where some of those issues may be actually very difficult to fix, even if you knew that they existed. Resources issues. You'd rather people serve in the client-facing portions of the business many customers rather than few, because you get better economics. But if you've overloaded folks and they can't do certain aspects of their job well, that may be invisible to you as the manager. And it's very difficult for the individual employee to tell you that. And so I just think it's very important to be ruthlessly honest in your diagnosis and to not assume that people in the role are the problem, because the biggest challenge that you can run into if your employee feels like you are subtly implying or thinking that they're the problem, then you lose all your opportunity to coach them, because they're going to be defensive, they're going to be afraid, they're going to feel insecure, and that makes it so difficult to fix problems.
I love what you're saying there. Some of the best, I think, management advice I was given a few years back in my career, looking at trying to diagnose and coach through performance issues, specifically with salespeople. My manager told me he or she is the right guy or gal until they are not. And you act on that presupposition and with that intent. There's not this subtle implication that I don't really think you're doing the work. I don't really believe in you, because, as you said, that erodes trust. It downgrades their motivation. And so you have to operate with that mindset, which I think, as you're saying, helps the relationship between the manager and the direct report. It also feeds into, if you're not going directly to that assumption that they're not doing the work or they're not the right fit, whatever the case might be, there's skill and will involved in getting people in the right seats, right? But it forces you to take that ruthless look at, is this a process issue? Is this an organizational issue first? So I love what you're saying there, and it's echoing that career and managerial advice I've gotten before. Let's talk a little bit about some of the consequences. You mentioned the effects that can have on the organization beyond just, the individual. As we heard from your story, those should not be taken lightly at all. And at the same time, we want to look at the organizational impact as well, right, Micah?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say one brief word about coaching before we go there too, because I realized I missed it earlier, which is coaching an employee who actually is struggling, especially in a context where there are other things that are not optimal, and helping that person reach performance is both the most challenging thing that I've done as a manager and the most rewarding. So it's very difficult. And I think, again, if you don't have people who have done many reps as a manager, many repetitions, it's going to be difficult for them to do that. So I didn't want to leave that behind in the diagnosis talk. So on to consequences. I think the consequences of fire fast are really quite significant. The biggest among them is, if you fire somebody and you don't have a really good idea about the set of things going on that cause them to fail, then you haven't learned what matters for your company. Secondly, you are likely going to have the incoming person dealing with many of the same issues, even if that person is stronger in the areas where the person who's been ousted was weak. They're still going to deal with many of the same environmental, resourcing, cultural issues that person was with. And you missed a chance to learn and to really be honest about those factors, a chance that will help the new incoming person be successful, and that could help your company grow and improve things that actually do need to change for the company to be successful long term. Lastly is opportunity cost. If you've got a person who is missing from your company in a key role, and you're back into that slow hiring mentality, and again, you didn't really make an honest or thorough assessment about what was causing the lack of success, then you have things that are not getting done every day. Either they're getting done by somebody else on your team, in which case they're likely being done at a subpar level and they're costing you in ways that you don't understand, morale, financially, other ways, or they're not getting done at all and your business is suffering as a result. So that doesn't mean that you don't have to let people go at some point, that you don't have to keep people accountable for their results and the things that they're responsible for. It just means the cost of letting somebody go is so significant on the opportunity cost front. Not to say, not to overlook the morale front, as people think to themselves, I actually thought Micah was okay, and yet he's gone. So does that mean that I'm not safe in my job? That morale issue, if people think that you as a manager make snap decisions that are ill-considered, that impacts their morale as well.
100%, Micah. I think that you're shining a great light on how we can dispel this common myth, especially for startups, because there are unique factors involved. And going back to, where you opened the conversation, just because you hear this advice and you hear a little bit of the story doesn't mean that you can just blanket apply it to your situation. And some of the things that you've called out here, like you might not have the hiring process to really hire well and slow. Hiring slow doesn't mean that you're doing a better job at hiring. And then taking a hard look at when you want to fire fast, or when you think you need to. I don't think any of us want to fire people, but looking internally and looking organizationally at some of the causes and some of the consequences if you are too premature in that area. So I've loved this conversation, Micah. I can tell you're passionate about it and knowledgeable, and your experience, I think, is going to provide some lessons to listeners today. So on that note, if anybody listening to this would like to stay connected with you or reach out and ask any follow-up questions, what's the best way for them to reach out or learn more about what you and the team at Fountain are up to?
You can reach out on LinkedIn. Just mention in your connection request that you heard me on this podcast. I get a lot of connection requests that come from random directions. So I'm not going to respond to all of them, but I'm happy to respond if I know that folks have encountered me in this context.
I love it. Micah, thank you again for the conversation and the time today on the show, man.
Glad to do it. Thank you for having me.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.